Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Last Week This Morning, where Markham and I recap the top stories from energy media last week. Markham, I want to talk a little bit, start the show off a little bit with why we do what we do, and maybe talk about some possible actions that people can take or that our viewers can take if they feel inspired by our work.
Well, I just got finished doing an interview with Jigar Shah, who is one of the leading thinkers about clean energy in the world, and certainly under the Biden administration, he ran the Department of Energy's loan program. This is a guy that gets it in a very deep way, very profound way, and he's very articulate about it. When I listen to Jigar Shah outline where the world is going, it's very clear to me that Canada is 5 to 10 years behind. And there's good
Yeah.
reason for that. I mean, we're a major oil and gas producer, so that's been our focus. We've had a very clean, low cost, reliable power grid. We haven't had the pressures that other countries have had, on and on. But what that means is we don't have a conversation, a narrative around clean energy and energy change. We don't have political constituencies that have been developed that support that narrative and, bring forward policy suggestions or put pressure on governments, that sort of thing, and we really need it. And so I want to call on our viewers is support what we do and plug yourself into that conversation. You can comment on our stuff on social media and other threads, share our videos, uh, email and write your member of parliament and your MLA, about the various issues because there's always policy on the table that's being developed. Get involved. Get involved. Don't be passive anymore. This where the change in the global energy system is going to change Canada's competitiveness going forward. Whether we have continue to have the lifestyle that we do, or it goes up or down depending on how we respond. This is not something Canadians want to be passive about. We want to be involved in that political constituency. So that's the overarching theme here is get involved, get engaged, plug in, and take part.
Well, and I can't emphasize enough that circulation matters. Those videos where we have more shares, where more of our followers share the videos, they always do better. I also think it really helps when you start to have these kind of kitchen table discussions. That's how we bring more viewers to our show as well. And it's always about asking. Right now, Mark and I are really focused on asking our politicians for accountability. So asking those questions. You've heard us say this many times, do the math. We need to ask our elected officials, are they doing the math on these big projects they're proposing? What is at risk for taxpayers? How is Canada going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years into the future? So again, if you like our channel, make sure you subscribe and of course share our videos as much as possible. I want to dive right into last week's topics now. Now, one story that got a lot of coverage was the massive LNG glut. So maybe you can kind of walk us through that and tell us what might be coming in the future.
This is really interesting. I mean, Canada has a nascent LNG industry. We've got a couple of small projects. We've got the very large $40 billion LNG Canada that began shipping LNG not that long ago. There's a potential phase two that made it as a national project on the Government of Canada's major projects list. And there's a lot of pressure building to expand LNG in a very big way, to build more plants, to extract more natural gas up in the northeast of BC, build a pipeline to get it down to get it where it needs to go. What we don't talk about in Canada is will there be customers for it in the
Right.
future? Because it takes 4 or 5 years to build one of these things. And one of the a key piece in the global LNG picture is supplies are tight today. But starting next year and heading to 2028, we're literally adding 50% more liquefaction capacity. And
Right.
depending on who you talk to, for instance, the IEA, even in their conservative steps scenario, shows a glut of LNG capacity of oversupply out well into the 2030s. And in the APS, it's even more pronounced. And I've talked to people like Anne-Sophie Corbeau from Columbia
Right.
University, and he says, look, because of the glut of oversupply that's coming on board, and it's mainly from Qatar and the United States, with some from Canada as well. Because of that oversupply, uh, it's not clear that demand is certain for it. Because, and Jigger Shaw made this point during the interview, is all nations around the world who are fossil fuel importers don't want to import anymore. They don't want to pay money because it's very important. Last year, China spent $325 billion importing crude oil and 40 to 50 billion importing natural gas. That's a lot of money to send out of your economy when you can burn
Right.
coal or you can install wind and solar, generate electricity domestically, and power your economy that way. And so the point that Corbeau makes is between now and 2050, there are major, major uncertainties. Will the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline from Russia to China get built?
Yeah.
62 billion cubic meters of gas, which is like 12 or 13% of all the gas in the world. Um, what will happen with electrification in the global south? Will that lower the demand for LNG? So we did some work. We emailed the Department of Natural Resources Canada. We emailed the BC government. We know where the Alberta government stands on this. And I can say with some certainty that they all adhere, their vision of the future for LNG and for oil too is guided by the IEA steps scenario, by OPEC, by oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell. They have a very bullish view of LNG's future, and I think that that's too risky. Because we do so much work at the global level on electrification. I think that Anne-Sophie Corbeau was correct, and there's a a very good chance that electrification will reduce the demand for gas, and Canada
Right.
could get stuck with stranded assets. Taxpayers could get stuck with the loss of subsidies, with having to clean up stranded assets like pipelines and so on. So there there's a big error bar here. It could go this way or it could go this way. And you have to you have to factor in risk. And we're not doing
Right.
that in Canada, in my opinion.
Well, and this is the exact thing we're asking people to hold their elected leaders to account for, asking these kind of the big question, who's going to pick up the tab if these become stranded assets, or if these major projects underperform
Yeah.
massively because we haven't accounted for these huge risks.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So I actually want to talk a little bit about, you had a big story last week that the oil industry has turned on Trump.
Well, this it's not like you could see this coming a mile away. Because Trump promised that he would drive down the price of gasoline.
Right.
He's pressured the OPEC members to bring more supply. They had cut a lot of millions of barrels of production capacity, so he pressured them to bring some of that capacity back into the market to drive down the price of oil. And as Ed Hurst, the energy economist from the University of Houston that we interview all the time, as Ed keeps pointing out, the shale producers in the US are not the low cost producer in the world. In fact, they're a
Right.
marginal barrel. They're only profitable when oil prices are high, as they have been now for a while, thanks to OPEC. So now
Hmm.
that oil is coming down to, 65, $62 a barrel, those producers are pulling back.
Right.
They're contracting. They're not drilling as nearly as many wells. It looks like in the next year or two, production's going to start to decline, that sort of thing. And they're pointing the finger, and quite rightly, at Donald Trump because the price of oil is falling in part because of his trade policies.
Right. Yeah.
And his political policies, any pressuring of OPEC and he's slowing down the global economy because of his tariff war and so on. They're not happy. They're really not happy. So yeah, that's been kind of interesting how one of his, a group that was one of his biggest supporters, now that he's in
Right.
power and his policies are starting to bite, are going, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, that's not what we voted for.
Well, on the campaign trail, we were hearing drill, baby, drill, and everyone was getting pretty excited about that. So maybe the tides have turned. And that leads me right into our next story. You talked to StatsCan last week, and it looks like things are turning for Canadians. Well, I mean, this has been a long time coming now, but the numbers are starting to come out in August. We've got less people going to the US, traveling less to the US.
There's been a spate of news stories recently about places like Las Vegas who are absolutely begging Canadians to come back. And it's not just Canadians, it's Europeans, it's Mexicans, it's all sorts of folks who are staying home or going someplace else. So I
Right.
interviewed an analyst from Stats Canada. They had put out a report in June about their data, and she talked about how it would, the most up-to-date data shows the same trends. So in the springtime, after Trump's tariff wars and threats and Canada's pushback, it really dropped. I mean, massively dropped. 30 to 40% on car trips to the U.S., which is most of the it accounts for about 75 or 80% of Canadian trips to the U.S. So we're not
Right.
going. And a lot of what remains is people, folks who maybe aren't bothered at the border and business travel, where
Right.
people don't have as much, don't have options the way they do for leisure travel. But it's very clear that the decline that started in the spring has continued into the fall. The question now becomes, is this a structural change in the way we travel or where we travel? Are we going, our flights to other countries, maybe to Europe and elsewhere, are up substantially? Do we continue that? Or will there be a gradual settling into old patterns and eventually Canadians start to go back to travel? I would argue that based on the policies we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration now, that's not giving Canadians a lot of confidence that we're going to get back to a status quo. And by the way,
Yeah.
and Charlie Angus, who was on the show a couple of weeks, was it last week or the week before? We do so many
The
of
week
these, I
before.
forget sometimes.
Yeah.
So the week before. But Charlie made the point that we forget there are 150 Canadians right now being detained by ICE in the United States.
Yes.
And we've had a couple of high profile cases where people who are completely innocent, they haven't committed a crime, and yet they got trapped at the border for some silly reason, and ICE just put them into detention, and next thing you know, they spend 2 to 3 weeks essentially in a jail for no reason whatsoever. And so,
Yeah.
Canadians will read those stories. Canadians are concerned about that. And so, unless there's a major change coming out of the Trump administration, I don't see any change. Oh, and we should mention, do you remember when I interviewed Kenneth Jackson, the Surrey-based
Yeah.
visa expert? And
Yeah.
there's a reason why Canadians are having trouble. And he said that when Trump came in, one of the first things he did was order the border services to conduct extreme vetting. Now, what that means is there are a lot of rules on the books for access into the United States that over the decades have become fairly relaxed. I mean, Canadians just aren't a threat to Americans, and so the border guards. We've all driven into the U.S.
Yeah.
and it can be pretty relaxed, right? And Trump said no. Going forward, we want you to practice extreme vetting, which means that it's like a work to rule. Every rule in that book, we want you to enforce in an extreme fashion. And so now you're seeing a lot of Canadians get pulled out of the line and being frisked, or they get some other one. So
Car search,
yeah,
that kind of
this
thing.
is this is not just a perception issue. This is according to Jackson, This is, in fact, a direct order out of the White House to the border guards to do things differently.
Right. Yeah, well, and we'll see if those numbers continue. Like, is this going to, like you said, is it going to recover, or are people actually going to start avoiding US travel over the long term? Now, I'm going to switch here gears again, but we're going to continue talking about Trump. There was a Wall Street Journal article that also came out that you did a story on around the basically this kind of race, is the US forfeiting the clean race, energy race to China? And, you know, what do you have to say about that?
Well, a couple of months ago, the New York Times did a very similar piece, and I made a video about it, arguing that in fact they're framing the issue correctly. China is
Right.
clearly is clearly the first electro state, and it both manufactures clean energy technologies like wind turbines and solar panels and batteries, and it manufactures all of the demand devices like electric vehicles and heat pumps and industrial processes, and the technology that connects the two. So we're
Right.
talking about high voltage DC lines and all sorts of technology,
Hmm. All the
digital controls.
components.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and now it is not only deploying that at a terrific scale inside China, it's also exporting that technology into the global south in a big,
Yeah.
big way. So we
Right.
saw Pakistan, for instance, adopt a lot of rooftop solar, and the
Yep.
demand on their grid in 2024 dropped by 9%. I mean, the move by China to drive the electrification of the global south economies, it cannot be understated. And
Hmm.
as again, Jigger Shaw explained today, because I asked him very clearly, what was the motivation in 2020, 2021 for the Biden administration to move so aggressively on clean energy manufacturing and, scaling up supply chains and so on? And so he said, look, we get it. This is where the direction, the global energy system is going. We don't want to depend on Chinese supply chains, et cetera. Trump has come in and now he's made it very clear that he hates clean energy technologies. He rants about
Yep.
wind and causing cancer and so on, spreads a lot of
Nosebleeds.
misinformation. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And on top of that, he's pushing as part of his trade deals more exports of American LNG and crude oil. And
Right.
he's talked about energy dominance, by which he means that the American coal, oil, and gas exports are a means of exercising American political power around the world. That's the way he sees
Right.
it. So the Wall Street Journal argued that essentially the two superpowers have chosen very different energy models. China is going in the direction of electricity and clean energy tech, and Trump is doubling down, tripling down on the energy of the 20th century, coal, oil, and gas. And the reason why it's important is because the New York Times may be the paper of record, but in the US, but the Wall Street Journal is the paper of money. It's the
Right.
paper that people, like investors, Wall Street stockbrokers, the folks who are investing and control capital and direct it, they read the Wall Street Journal. It's like their Bible. And so when the
Right.
Wall Street Journal says China's electrifying, the United States is not, it's doubling down on oil and gas, that is a big deal. And I think that the message that's being sent to the American business and political classes is beginning to change. And despite Trump's efforts at energy dominance, the folks, the smart money, get it that clean energy is the future, and that's the way the global economy is going.
Right. And that story you had about Bloomberg NEF too was talking about how China leads the EV adoption in the global south. They're sending more cars down there, and we're seeing people, it's an economic issue now. People are choosing EVs because they're actually cheaper or about the same price. The capital expense, the capex is no longer a hurdle to jump.
I interviewed Colin McCarricker, who's the head of Bloomberg NEF's transportation group, and his work
Right.
does first. He, uh, if you want to listen to Colin and I geek out on technology adoption theory, there's an episode on our old Energy Talks podcast where we spent an hour talking about S curves and bell curves and all sorts of things. And I know from interviewing him over the last 3 years that his team has a very, very sound grasp of the theory behind energy technology and why it's
Right.
diffusing as fast as it is. And that then informs their work on EV adoption, battery adoption, oil displacement, and so on. So there's a series of interviews. There are 4 or 5 that I did with him, short ones. That was the first one. We'll have another one up today. And it's all about why the global south is choosing electric vehicles. And part of it is China. Part of it is that the global south, just like it did in telecommunications. Remember,
Right.
when
Cell
mobile
phone.
came along, instead of
Yep.
building landlines in Africa, everybody bought a cell phone, and they
Yep.
just leapfrogged over the old technology. OPEC in particular doesn't think that's going to happen. It says that, the global south will continue to burn petrol, oil and gas and coal, and we won't see much of a change between now and 2050. Colin, good Canadian boy, by the way, from Quadra Island in BC, Colin argued the opposite. In fact, that we're going to see electrotech uh, begin to displace oil and gas in the very near future. Now, how fast it will go will depend on China because China is moving so quickly that the forecasters can't even keep up. The data can't
Right.
keep up. And so we're having a hard time wrapping our head around this, but it's going faster. China's speed is even faster than we think it is. And so all of that combined makes for very interesting conversations around the spread of electric transportation.
Well, and I think the key word you're using here is displacement, which is definitely going against, OPEC's view on things at all. Now, there's only one more story I want to talk about. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit. You called Mark Carney, big oil Mark Carney last week, and I was wondering if you could just enlighten us a little bit about that.
This is a contentious issue in the energy media community because our viewers, I think, by and large, would be Mark Carney supporters.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of enthusiasm when he was elected in the spring, and became prime minister. Now he's got a PhD in economics. He's got a sparkling CV, and he's just really smart. And so people want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but we're not here. That's not our job to be Mark Carney's cheerleader. And so we know from the work we've done in Alberta that the Smith government and the Alberta oil and gas industry generally think of the energy future very differently, and they take OPEC's view. So
Right.
their view is that oil and gas is actually ready for a major expansion because of growth in the global south, and they see this as an opportunity. So what
Yeah.
do the policymakers think? Well, I emailed the Department of Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson's ministry. He's the
Yeah.
energy minister, and an old associate of Mark Carney's when he was at Goldman Sachs, and he was a deputy under Mark Carney at the Bank of Canada. So these two are
Right.
joined at the hip, right? Carney brought him in to do deals and make things happen, and he's a big oil bull. Big LNG bull, very bullish on this stuff. And so I
Yeah.
asked the department in an email which modeling scenarios inform the department and the minister's view of the energy future. And
Hmm.
they said mostly the IEA's, the International Energy Agency's STEP scenario.
Steps.
And that of
Yeah.
the three, that's the most conservative. That's the most status quo modeling. Then there's the APS, which is, uh, demand falls quite a bit starting in the 2030s. And then there's the net zero, which, by 2050 is almost. So of those two,
Right.
the analysts and economists that we interview generally think that the APS scenario is the most likely. So my argument was that here we are talking about, more LNG. We're talking about an expansion of the oil sands. We're talking about constructing a pipeline out to the West Coast, maybe Kitimat, maybe Prince Rupert. I mean,
Prince
those are
Rupert.
tens of billions of dollars of investment. And I argued that our political leaders are taking the wrong view of where oil and demand gas is going. It's not going to remain static. It's not going to grow. We're going to see the electrification of the global south, and that's going to lower the demand for oil in the very, very near future. And at the very, very least, our policymakers should be looking at that and going, what are the risk factors here? What are the
Yeah.
risks that our view of the energy future doesn't come true, and we're putting taxpayer dollars at risk here? And when you listen to Tim Hodgson is, he's a cheerleader in the mold of Danielle Smith, the Alberta premier. He's a little more, pro climate or so on, but not by much. And so what we've done, and then in BC, it's exactly the same thing. I emailed Adrian Dix's
Office.
department, and they replied, and they said IEA's step scenario and the other more conservative scenarios. So the three governments that are most involved in the oil and gas industry, BC, Alberta, and the government of Canada, are all kind of looking at the rosiest view possible of the demand for oil and gas out to mid-century. I think
Yeah.
that's a big mistake. It's a big mistake, and we could get caught with stranded assets and the loss of taxpayer subsidies and investments.
So, I mean, that leads us right in, kind of wrapping us up right from the start. This is telling people get the information. Markham here on the show often breaks down the data for us, so watch our clips, and that will prep you to ask the hard questions. And also share this information with your friends, with your neighbors. Get out there and talk to people. The power of conversation is often understated, but it's these little conversations bit by bit that chip away at people's worldview. And that's kind of what our work here does. Again, I want to remind people, please like and subscribe. It supports us a lot. And we also have a membership program on YouTube. So if you do like the work and want to financially support us, that's the way to do that. And Mark and I will be going live again this week on Facebook and YouTube again. So if you have questions that you'd like us to address, or comments that you'd like me to read live to Markham, please send them to me either in the DMs or comment on some of our posts. You can always email us at theenergyshow@gmail.com. And Markham, I'm going to give you the last word before we end the show.
Well, thanks, MC. I want to remind viewers that we are about 150 subscribers from hitting the 30,000 mark on YouTube. And that's a big number in Canada. It's not, if you're in the United States, it's not such a big number. But when you have kind of a nerdy energy show like we do, and you get 30,000 folks subscribing, and once we hit 30, I think we're just going to keep growing. And I think what that does is it illustrates how much interest there is in this topic, and how Canadians actually are now beginning to plug into the conversation, and they're looking to our channel for information. And so we really appreciate that. We do. And I echo your call to, subscribe, support us if you can, by becoming a member, et cetera, et cetera.
So thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see you on the live this week. If not, Mark and I will be back again next week, next Monday, to recap the coverage for this week. Take care, everyone.